The following presentation on Xaverian Spirituality invites us to consider our congregation's spiritual exercises. The characteristics of prayer life in Xaverian communities prior to the Second Vatican Council were not that different from those followed by other religious congregations. Our spiritual exercises were regular, as well as regulated, and they possessed a certain external tangibility. Thus, the times and places for prayers were very strictly defined. You can pray here, but you can't pray there. The text for every communal prayer had to be legitimate and known by heart, not only the rituals of the church, but also those that are said by the brothers from their rising to sleeping, and before and after communal activities. Demeanor during prayer was prescribed to all. Devotional prayers were added to supplement the rituals observed in communities, even to the point that more emphasis was given to the exercise of these pious activities. In essence, Xaverian prayer life before the Council can be characterized as being conventional, but to the point of being overly formal. Also routine, but to the point of being monotonous. It was compartmentalized, to the point of being seemingly disconnected from the ministerial life of the brothers, and also was ceremonial, to the point of scrupulosity with forms and details. Most of us know that the Second Vatican Council ushered a renewal in religious life. This updating, also known as aggiornamento, was heralded by the Council's summons that religious congregations faithfully hold in honor the spirit and special aims which their founders had set before the members, as well as the congregation's sound traditions. However, we must also bear in mind that the Council understood that this renewal in religious life, particularly in those that we now call as apostolic communities, should not only take place in the updating of ministries. Here's a quote from Perfecta Caritatis. It should be constantly kept in mind, therefore, that even the best adjustments made in accordance with the needs of our age will be ineffective unless they are animated by a renewal of spirit. This must take precedence over even the active ministry. So the renewal of spirit in the mind of the Council can be best understood by its renewed understanding of the religious nature of every human being. We are different from all other creations of God according to the Second Vatican Council, and this is by virtue of our capacity to lead our lives in communion with God. Here's a quote from Gaudium et Spes. The dignity of human beings rests on the fact that they are called to communion with God. This invitation to converse with God is addressed to people as soon as they come into being. They cannot live fully according to truth unless they freely acknowledge that love and entrust themselves to the Creator. Now, how can a congregation facilitate the renewal of its life of prayer and the conversation of its members with God? In the mind of the Council, this renewal would occur through a transformation of the understanding as well as the practice of private and public prayer in religious communities. Within their private arena, the trajectory that the Council pointed out was toward a renewed appreciation for contemplation among religious. Thus, the Council says in Perfecta Caritatis, seeking God solely and before everything else, the members of every community should join contemplation by which they fix their minds and hearts on Him with apostolic love by which they strive to spread the kingdom of God. In the public arena of religious congregations, the renewal was to take place by an act of reclaiming the liturgies of the Church. Before the Council, The effectiveness of the Mass depended solely on the priest who says it while the congregation attended it. The Council brought about a change in our understanding by emphasizing that the Mass is the highest prayer of all the faithful, a celebration that involves not only priests, but those participating in it as well. The place of the Word in the Mass was even highlighted as an essential aspect of the Mass. The renewal of liturgy for the entire Church was also expected to take place in religious communities. Thus, Perfecte Caritatis counseled us, religious should have recourse daily to the Holy Scriptures. They should celebrate the sacred liturgy, especially the Mass, with both lips and heart as the Church desires, and so nourish their spiritual life from this richest of sources. The renewal of the Church's understanding of liturgy also brought about another palpable and, at that time, very radical change in religious life. For centuries, the praying of the divine office was a privilege given exclusively to members of what were officially known as religious orders, and this is because their religious vows were seen as far elevated and truly perfect in value. This was compared to those who were members of religious congregations in simple vows, like the Xaverian Brothers. They were forbidden to pray the divine office. Instead, the members of these congregations were permitted to pray the so-called little office of the Blessed Virgin Mary every day. Now, Vatican II threw away the concept of solemn and simple vows, emphasizing that they were vows of the same value and dignity before God and before the Church. In so doing, it also gave religious the right to pray the divine office, whether they were members of religious orders or religious congregations. Here's a quote from Perfecta Caritatis. Although religious who recite a little office, truly approved, perform the public prayer of the Church, it is recommended that religious institutes should recite in full or in part the divine office, instead of a little office. They will thus share more intimately in the liturgical life of the Church. So changes began to take place in religious congregations. Some of us may even remember how these changes took place in Xaverian communities right after the Council ended in 1965. Indeed, our leaders sought to implement these changes. However, the jury is still out as to whether our members were properly formed to understand and implement the changes that the Council idealized. On the other hand, it is also clear that something happened to many religious, including ours, after the Council. There was an observable movement for many to move gradually, if not immediately, from one form of prayer life before the Council to another form after the Council. In some communities, the life of prayer moved from being communal and mandatory to one that became more private, individual, and voluntary. Some of us became convinced that the life of prayer needs not to be sacramentalized or even ritualized. Yet we also had communities wherein the Mass and Divine Office, which the Council encouraged us to reclaim, devolved into rituals and exercises that, unfortunately, became conventional, routine, detached, and ceremonial. In short, the problematic dispositions toward prayer life that existed in our communities prior to Vatican II were simply continued in post-conciliar times in some of our communities. The challenge before us is to describe how we as Xaverians pray today. At this point in time, 50 years after the Council, we are faced with the possibility that we, as individuals and as communities, may not have measured up to the call to be in communion with God. Now that would be a sad state, for, as the theologian Sandra Schneider pointed out so well, every religious is called to the contemplative life, not as an accompaniment of other activities or as one feature among others, but as the very meaning and end of the life that they have undertaken. A religious life which is not contemplative, at whatever stage of development at a given time, is a contradiction in terms and tragically pointless. At this point, let us pause for a while and reflect on the following two questions. Number one, describe your prayer life today as a Xaverian. What do you do to establish communion with God? Number two, in what ways have your spiritual exercises changed from the time you joined the Xaverians to the present moment? We will resume the presentation after you have done your personal reflection and sharing.